to mind, and have you ever all heard of intersectionality, the concept of looking at oppression from various vantage points? And that is looking at how both race and gender, sexuality, and social status, such as class, impact a person's outcome in the system. So it's not just, we shouldn't just be concentrating on the abuse of black male bodies, because when we do that, we ignore this long history of isolating women and subjecting them to state violence. But the most dangerous part is that we're re-victimizing the community itself again. We're pitting men against women in the minority community, and there can be no progress when we have dichotomies, one gender against another gender. But also, a lot of scholars are talking about the mass incarceration rate, that more black people are in prison today than in 1850, the book by Michelle Alexander on the new Jim Crow. When we look at this prison industrial complex, we oftentimes don't ask, well, how many women are in prison? There are 2.3 million people in America in prison right now. 1 million of them are women. You don't hear that. You hear the 1 million black men that are there, but 1 million are women. And so the number of women that are being incarcerated is going up astronomically since 2000, within the past 10 years, and it's escaping under the radar. Why? That is because there is a hierarchy in violence. There is a political hierarchy that men have, and when a male's body is imprisoned or hurt or harmed, it counts more. And what we're sending a message to is that black female bodies actually matter even less than a black male body.
So I'm thinking about, just from that, Becky Ritchie's book, right, on black women and the prison industrial complex, right? And I'm also thinking about the ways in which we have this idea about deviance, right? And it's also connected to black women, and also just to let you go, Frank, but just for us to think about the ways in which black women who are incarcerated are also the victims of sexual violence, right? And they're usually the victims of sexual violence outside as well as inside the penitentiary, and how there isn't a movement, right, around the conditions of these women who are in prison.
Absolutely. Just to piggyback, Zing, I'm so happy you said that. That part of the problem with this narrative is that there has tended to be a privileging of violence that happens in the public sphere. But when you think about how violence against black bodies historically, the violence against black men has traditionally taken place in the public sphere, right? From the lynching tradition, as we've mentioned, lynching being a very public spectacle. Violence against black women has often taken place in the private sphere, right? And so when you think about the legacy of rape, when you think about the legacy of the kind of state violence embedded in welfare reform and welfare legislation, we think about the history of police raids on in black women's homes. So much of the violence against black women has taken place in the private sphere, and in the way we narrativize black violence, we tend to only privilege what has happened in the public sphere. So that's one of the things that needs to change. Related though, in terms of this kind of hierarchy of which black lives matter, it's not only a question of gender, it's also a question of sexuality, right? That when you think about someone like Elon Netos, right, a teenager, a trans woman who was murdered last summer in Harlem, New York, by another black person, a black man. Where is her story, right? And so, in terms of the, not only do we need to think about broadening the boundaries to include the lives and the value of black women, we need to also include and talk about the value of non-cisgendered queer folk, right, who are also being murdered and maimed, and their stories are not being told, right? And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter, it means that all Black lives matter, not just the lives of heterosexual black men.
Thank you. So I want to get back to this, even though I think Melissa showed examples of men, primarily, well, all men, this idea that a number of the people that she showed were young people, right? And we're in a setting where usually young people are, right? I'm not that old. But this idea around deviance and youth, right, as a central role that in the ways in which we think about police brutality versus maintaining public order. So a lot of the discourse has been around youth activists, right? And the everyday kind of acts of violence that happens to youth in marginalized communities. But also this inability of police and law enforcement to engage a young group of, you know, people in the neighborhood and have that kind of interaction. This idea that police officers are maintaining order. And in order for that to happen, they have to use tactics like stop and frisk to maintain order in communities. So I wanted to see, you know, how are we thinking, what's the narrative for young people? Is it this idea of deviance? And how does that play in how we should think about kind of solutions to working with young people in our communities?
It's also a generational divide. I think you hear the phrase sort of politics of respectability thrown out a lot, and which has also sort of become this generational contention of how you present yourself before white people, being acceptable or being respectable before white people. That I think the younger generations, these millennials, did not grow up with the same sort of urgency about being respectable at all times. The sort of Cosby Show era that I grew up in very much. And I think there is a tendency to sort of look at black bodies through this deviance, through this lack of respect, right? But it's not just a lack of respect for white authority, but white supremacy. Every single thing that black bodies are doing, the way they move, the way they dress, the way they speak, is sort of an affront against white supremacy and how we challenge people. And it's a sort of the same thing, and it goes back to maybe a question that we were talking about before in terms of women and how women are seen where men, when they're victims of police brutality, it's almost as though we're quick to sort of say what kind of person they are. We're quick to sort of show this image of them as either a football player or as a scholar. But we don't always rush to do the same thing with women as well. I think we, as a case in point, the president of Lincoln University kind of asked questions about sexual assault. Well, what were you wearing? Well, what were you doing? Well, how did you provoke this? We don't give women the same sort of grace that we give men. But these images in terms of how we present ourselves, right, or how we should be presenting ourselves, is a huge debate. It's a huge debate. There are a lot of people who want to sort of throw the politics of respectability out the window and say, it doesn't matter what I was wearing. I was unarmed. It doesn't matter what I was doing. You know, this has nothing to do with why I'm being pulled over. But the perceptions of deviousness, I think, affect both men and in particular women, right? We're always sort of seen as being these either hypersexual, sexualized characters or you know, something that we ask for, right, that I think becomes intensely problematic. But it's something that needs to be definitely addressed because I think the politics of respectability was a valid argument in the 70s and in the 80s when it was particularly most popular. But now I think that there's a disconnect between how generations feel as though they should present themselves when walking down the street or when handling themselves in the classroom or in their neighborhood. And that disconnect is also being seen with police enforcement as well.
Yeah, when I think about this topic, I don't know if the politics of respectability has had such weight in the community for a very, very long time. We saw that in the Black Liberation Movement and the dawn of the Black Power movement, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, these leaders were challenging politics of respectability. They were showing up in court with black donning afros and black, leather coats because they didn't care about showing homage or respect to the state. When they had these trials, they oftentimes wouldn't even look up at the court. And in my research, I look at how people that had been harassed, stopped and frisked, and victims of police brutality, when they complained, they found themselves actually being accused of crime themselves, resisting arrest or so. And then they would be in court. And they would have to maintain a certain respect for the court, but they refused. Malcolm X is the one who says, why should I honor any man's court that doesn't honor me? Any man's law that doesn't honor us, in other words. So I do think there is a miscommunication or a misconceptualization of black deviance in urban areas, black deviance among youth. It's not deviance as in something negative, it's actually something political. Refusing to pull up your pants when you know that means that you're probably going to be stopped by police is not, you're not doing that because you are out of touch with society. You're doing it because you're making a statement, a political statement. And our laws have always looked at dress as a political statement. Look this case up, the zoot suit cases. These cases happened during World War II, where Mexicans and on the West Coast were wearing attire that was really, really baggy suits. And they were refusing to wear something that was slim-fitted because they were not honoring rations on materials and manufacturing clothes. So that was a political stance. And there was whole riots about this, attacking people because of the way they dress. So any conversation that says that a youth from our community should look a certain way in order to earn certain rights is unfair. It's blaming the victim, and that's where we go wrong.
So I'll still get pulled up if I have my pants down.
And you know, it's also important, you know, just a couple of things. So, a couple of things here. Because I feel so strongly about this, because it's a narrative that we've heard so many times, and it really bothers me because we have to remember that the politics of respectability has never saved black lives.
No, it
right?
hasn't. No, it
Trayvon Martin was doing the right thing. He was on his way to his father's house. Mike Brown's final act was a gesture of respectability. Hands up. Respectability does not save black lives. So, and it's also important to remember that Ferguson as a movement is led by unrespectables, right?
Yeah.
Ferguson as a movement is led by people sagging their pants and listening to hip hop and cursing, and Ferguson is a youth-led movement, right? And this is exactly why, so two things, when I was most recently in Ferguson, the NAACP was booed. They've been booed every time they've come down there, in part because young people are sick of this disconnect between style and substance. So you can have on a three-piece suit, what does that mean when it comes time, when the shit hits the fan, so to speak? One of the things that people don't know about Cornel West is that, you know, I was there when Cornel West was arrested, and it's become the kind of national photo for what happened most recently during the Weekend of Resistance in Ferguson. But what people don't realize is that West barely made it onto stage the night before because he also was booed, right? Because there's this sort of growing sentiment among a young black youth that we don't need symbols anymore, we need substance. And that's part of what is kind of the disappointment of the Obama, to again go back to the Obama presidency, again, this disconnect between style and substance has to do with a politics of respectability. And Obama embodied that politics of respectability. Where has it gotten us as a community?
So I want us to go to, and I want